Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a nice evening tonight. We have Chris Eastman here. He's the manager of the local government training program at the New York State Department of State. Chris has a master's degree in regional planning from SUNY Albany. He's also been a city planner and a county planner, and he's also worked for the Preservation League of New York State. I'm sure many of you have been to his sessions in the evenings here and also at the Tug Hill Conference. We have what I feel is a really good topic tonight. Chris said he wants lots of questions, so he said you'll be able to raise your hand during the presentation and ask if something comes to mind during it. So I'm going to get out of the way here and let Chris do it.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks to everybody who came. I knew we had a decent-sized crowd tonight, and I wasn't sure if an evening like this, the weather kind of works against us because it's pretty tempting to be outside. But this is the bread and butter of zoning and what you do. And it's a relatively new course that I put together. And this past January, in response to a request, and there have been several over the years from county planners that ask us, do you have anything else for zoning boards of appeals? Anything else about use variances? Our zoning boards of appeals are giving too many use variances out. And I just say, well, the test is in our course, zoning board of appeals overview. What else can we say? We kind of beat people over the head with it. And then it occurred to me, I think there was a question about from the planner for whose conference I ultimately put the course together, having to do with a very minor use variance. And I said, well, why don't they just rezone it? And he said, oh, that's spot zoning. And it reminded me, local officials are really afraid of spot zoning. And that's why we have kind of a sarcastic title here. Spot zone or grant the illegal use variance. That's, we don't want to do either. They're both bad. So think of the situations that you find yourself in, and that's why I do encourage a conversation here. When Mike and Gene Waterbury from the Tug Hill Commission walked in, they said, so it's just you tonight? Like, I don't know if they were impressed or shocked or disappointed that it was just me, but because of that, I need their help and yours and that of the other county planners in the audience to make this a fruitful and fulfilling and instructive 2 hours about the zoning board of appeals and your community and planning in general. And that's why I go back to say this gets to the core of what you do, because and a question came to me just today by email from a member of the zoning board of appeals who said he doesn't think that this particular project is an area variance, or the request wouldn't be an area variance, it's a use variance because it's the expansion of a non-conforming use. And it sounded, just from what he described, it sounded pretty benign to me. And I thought to myself, is he just looking at the law with blinders on? Or is it really not a good project? And I really feel like we have to talk. I suggested that he call the office and talk to one of my colleagues, or meet on Wednesday when I'm back in the office. So just before we really get into it, I want to let everybody know that I brought handouts of, does everybody have, and probably all have your handout for the course. I also brought sample copies of our publications. And there's a publication order form, which if you want to take one, that's the one to take because it has all of our publications listed. And if you don't have a good way to view them or print them, view them online, because they're all online, you can take that and we'll send you copies. Or if you have a friend or a fellow board member who really needs a copy of one of those, and you want to get it to that person subtly, put that person's address on and send it to us or give it to me at the end. There are also some other publications, the sample copies of the Kuhn series publications that touch on what we're going to be talking about tonight. Unfortunately, there's only one copy of Zoning Board of Appeals. We have a really good publication, Zoning Board of Appeals, and we're out of hard copies, I realized just last week. So I only brought one copy with me, but you can order others or look online. How many people here tonight are members of Zoning Boards of Appeals? It looks like the majority. Usually it's the other way around. Usually it's mostly planning board members. And how many, just for comparison, planning board members? Oh, maybe it's half and half. And then local governing board members? Great. It's important stuff for you. It's always great to see members of local governing boards in our audience. So just a quick outline of the course to come. We'll talk about zoning, we'll define zoning. How many people are in their first year on your local board, whatever it might be? Oh, a few of you. How about your first term? Those people, and who else in your first term on your board? So some of you are veterans, and but I always hope that long-time members can learn a little something. We're going to define the use variance, and we will go over the use variance test, the four-factor, very difficult to prove test. And then we'll define spot zoning. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll go through some cases about some spot zoning cases and some illegal use variance cases. So just to define zoning in its very essence, its most elemental and fundamental definition, zoning regulates use, density, and placement of structures on a site. So that means, and usually the first one is the most controversial. People say, you can't tell me what to do with my land. They don't say, you can't tell me how densely to build on my land, or you can't tell me where to put the structure or how high to build it. It's uses, and there are a number of municipalities, I doubt that there are any here, represented here, but there are a number of municipalities across the state that regulate not use, but the other things, placement of structures on the site, setback and height, and they don't call it zoning. They call it their land use law or just setback. And some of them have boards of appeals, but some of them don't. And if you don't have, if you're doing any of these things, even if you're not regulating use, if you have setback regulations, that's considered zoning. And you need a board of appeals. The board of appeals is something like a court that provides relief to those who have special circumstances, whose land has special circumstances and needs some relief from the law, just like a court. So the zoning board of appeals is more, we call it a quasi-judicial board. And the zoning regulations divide the municipality, town, village, or city into districts. And there are usually different uses allowed in those districts and different bulk and area requirements. And the result is there are different zones where certain densities and certain setbacks and heights and character of building are allowed. And that's where the name zoning comes from. And it's optional in New York State, but all cities have zoning, and most villages, and probably, I don't have the figures here, but most towns, probably 70 or 80% of towns have zoning. But there's still those. Is there anyone represented here that doesn't have zoning, a municipality here? I didn't think so. parts of the state that don't have zoning are the rural parts of the southern tier, and they're Washington County, strangely, which is really in the path of development, is one of the least zoned counties in the state. It's one of those strange things. It's between Saratoga County and Vermont. Vermont has lots of land use regulation even at the state, and Saratoga County is very fast growing, and Washington County is sitting there pretty rural and just skipped over by development. And most of the towns say, well, we don't need zoning, we have so little growth here. But they've been seeing it in the last few years more than they had 20 or 30 years ago. And the goal of zoning, of course, is to avoid incompatible uses, conflicting incompatible uses. So keep that in mind. This is the reason we do this. It's not just to tell people what to do, and zoning is kind of it's one of the reasons we say you should update your comprehensive plan fairly regularly. Zoning is kind of a living document because things change, trends change, and we have to try to be receptive to those changes in our local regulations. So the use variance, we're going to define the use variance here. It's to use land for a purpose not permitted by zoning. And we always say, these are a few slides from Zoning Board of Appeals overview, which we're doing tomorrow in Loudonville for anyone who's wants to come down and hear that, and land use moratorium tomorrow evening at the new branch of Jefferson County Community College. We're starting a little earlier than 6:30, I think 4:30. The alternative, we always say, is to rezone property, and that's where sometimes we get a little pushback, especially when we talk to people on the phone about rezoning, when we suggest, well, if this is a use that can't pass the test, which we're going to go through in just a minute, why don't you rezone the property? And people say, well, that's spot zoning, isn't it? How many people have heard of the term spot zoning, by the way? So most of you. And this, we imagine that somebody got a use variance for that car wash, which is incompatible with the uses around it, but maybe it was there before there was zoning in that neighborhood. So the use variance test is in these sections of statute: town law, village law, and general city law. It's right there in permitted action by the Zoning Board of Appeals. There are 3 sections of statute that pertain to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and this is where the test is found. And this test is, you might hear of the possibility in certain sections of statutes of a local government superseding statute and having, let's say, 7 planning board members or 7 members of the Zoning Board of Appeals, or superseding statute to have a comprehensive plan that's not written according to state statute. And that's a whole different legal conversation, but the point I'm making here is that these are hard and fast rules, that there have been cases that have said you can't supersede statute for the Zoning Board of Appeals test, the use variance test, or area variance test for that matter. These are where the state occupies the field and says this is what it's going to be. So you can't, at a local level, come up with your own rules for granting use variances. So it's very hard. And when I was a municipal planner, I went through planning school, and then I became a municipal planner, and then I had my own business for a while. And when I had my own business, I wanted to set up a shop in a neighborhood commercial district that had been an industrial neighborhood. And I was shocked to learn that it was an industrial neighborhood. And in that particular city, the planner said, you need a use variance. Sometimes people say that, you need a use variance. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to get a use variance. And I got the use variance. All the neighbors agreed that my shop would not have a detrimental impact on the surrounding uses, and the zoning board of appeals, it was in one meeting granted me a use variance. So then I did that for a while, and then I came to the Department of State, and this got drilled into me. So and now I talk about how difficult it is to get a use variance, how difficult it should be. So I know firsthand that I wanted a use variance. I didn't necessarily want to go to the city council and have them deliberate whether they should change the zoning on that one shop. But no reasonable return, unique circumstances, self-created. You can't have created your own hardship. And the one that a lot of people focus on is, I feel, the one that's easiest to prove. And when I was a municipal planner, people didn't come to my office and say, I need a use variance because I can't make a reasonable return on the property. They'd say, I've got a great idea and it's going to be great for the neighborhood. So they started with number 4. So we'll go through each one. The applicant must prove that, and the burden is on the applicant here, the burden of proof is on the applicant. The land is not capable of making a reasonable return with any permitted use. So it's not just the use that happens to be predominant on that property, but they have to go through all of the uses. And then any current non-conforming use, and we'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes, and any use permitted, granted by a previous use variance. So you've got a lot of options, and you have to take into account the entire property. So if there's a building on a 5-acre lot, and somebody says, I can't, this single-family residence just doesn't work here, it needs to be commercial, they haven't considered subdividing or anything else that's permitted. So consider the entire parcel as well. And we talk about the reasonable rate of return, and that's something that's a little bit, for some people, it's not hard and fast. It's not defined. It's a little bit almost abstract. But because there's no, like, sometimes people call us and they want a formula, but there's no formula. It's really, the power is in your hands as members of the Zoning Board of Appeals. You really have a lot of discretion here. It's where you get to be creative. You get to be like judges in a court, your appellate jurisdiction. And it depends on the facts. And that's why we don't have one member of the Zoning Board of Appeals. That's why we have at least 3, and in many cases 5, and in some cases 7. That's left over from an earlier statute. So the Zoning Board of Appeals makes that determination, and it doesn't have to be consistent. Even if the applicant has an expert's opinion and shows you a spreadsheet, the Zoning Board of Appeals doesn't have to agree with it. And the case here said that, and there were quotes from this case that come back in the cases we'll go through a little later on, Petrozelli versus the Zoning Board of Appeals of the Village of Dobbs Ferry, in which there was a vacant lot in a single-family residential zone, and Mrs. Petrozelli said, I want to build a 2-family house. It'll make me more money. And I'm going to build a house and sell it, and a 2-family house, I can rent it or sell it, but it'll be more valuable than a single-family home. And so I want a use variance. The rate of return on a single-family residential home is, a single-family residence is not sufficient for me. And the court said that a property owner is entitled to a reasonable rate of return, not necessarily the highest rate of return. And that's a line that appears in case after case. So the Zoning Board of Appeals said no. She said, you should give it to me, and the court said the Zoning Board of Appeals did the right thing. Unique circumstances. The property has to be the only or one of very few properties that suffers from the circumstances that have resulted in the owner needing a use variance. Neighborhood where the zoning would create a hardship. And this is an important line, the second bullet. It's the uniqueness of the land causing the plight, not the uniqueness of the plight of the owner. The owner's financial circumstances. The owner might have paid too much for a house during the real estate bubble and then had it for a few years and put a lot of money into it. Now can't get their money back and just feels like, you know, we've dropped the price a number of times. We need a use variance. We need something else to increase the value of this property so that we can get our money back. That doesn't work. One of the best examples I can come up with for truly unique circumstances, and actually it was among the circumstances that I found myself in with this shop. It was an industrial building in an industrial neighborhood that was rezoned neighborhood commercial. And there were a few neighborhood commercial buildings, but we made the argument that this light industrial use was something that in an industrial building was kind of a unique circumstance. It was a unique circumstance. But in this one, this is a common situation where there's a neighborhood school, and the school district might have vacated the school and sold it. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that in this case, somebody bought the school building before there was zoning, and then there was zoning, and the zoning passed. It became a two-family residential neighborhood. So the only R2, let's say. So the only uses allowed in this neighborhood are R2, are single and two-family residences. So let's say I bought the school before zoning passed, and I thought, oh my gosh, I was going to put a bunch of apartments in here. I have to rezone. I have to ask for a rezoning of the property because I can't make a reasonable return on this as a two-family residence. I was planning on putting 15 units in there, let's say, to make my investment back, to the rehab investment. And but somebody on the local governing board, somebody on the city council really doesn't like me, so they're not going to rezone it. I can appeal for a use variance, and these are unique circumstances. I own the building before the zoning changed. And the reason that's an important detail is because if the zoning changed and it were two-family residential, and then I bought the building, that would be self-created hardship. Knowing that or even if you don't know that the property is zoned a certain way and can't be used in another way, you still have, that hardship is still self-created if you buy it. So if, let's say, there's a scenario where somebody else owns it, let's say Jeannie owns the building, I'm going to redevelop it. I come in and I say, well, are you going to rezone it? No, they don't like me. Somebody on the city council doesn't like me. And then I say, or they say it's spot zoning. We can't zone that way. It's spot zoning. So then I appeal for a use variance as a contract vendee. I'm going to buy this building if it's given a use variance, then we can do it. And that is satisfies this factor in the test. And but spending money alone, as I keep saying on a project, like there's office space all over Albany available because the office market is soft. And if somebody said, hey, I need a use variance to turn this into something else because I can't rent it as an office, that wouldn't necessarily fly. And that's why I'll beat this one into the ground. Why considering rezoning isn't always is an option. It's always an option. Neighborhood character. So when you get through those three huge hurdles of reasonable return, unique circumstances, and self-created hardship, you have to prove that the use variance, if granted, will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. And again, this is where your job gets to be pretty interesting, because you as a zoning board of appeals can attach conditions to the use variance if it's granted, to be sure that something like this doesn't happen, where the just looking at these uses, they clash. How could this, ask yourselves, granting a use variance, let's say it's a coin laundry next door to a Victorian house, which could, for all we know, have a law office in it. That might be a commercial use as well, but the conditions that would make that use consistent with the character of the neighborhood are something that you should consider seriously. For area variance as well, of course, and we always talk about that in zoning board of appeals overview, because we know that more area variances are granted than use variances. Non-conforming uses. Pre-existing legal non-conforming uses are those uses that existed legally before the current zoning was passed, and they might not be legal today because of the changes in zoning. And that was the neighborhood that I was working in. I hadn't even realized the zoning had changed, because there are auto body shops all over that neighborhood, and a couple gas stations and service garages, and that's what had been the building that my little shop was in. Here we have a neighborhood bar, a neighborhood dive bar in Albany, and as far as I know, it coexists pretty peacefully in that neighborhood. It's kind of a fixture in that residential neighborhood, and across the street is a repair garage, and I think both are pre-existing non-conforming uses that have been allowed to remain. And those grandfather uses, that's another word for pre-existing non-conforming uses, are generally seen as very valuable because they're a use that's not allowed in the neighborhood anymore, and they get to continue. But they're not forever necessarily. Like if somebody closed that bar, or if let's say the owner retired and nobody else was around to run the bar, and the bar was closed for a year, in many zoning regulations, and this is local zoning regulations, not in statute, the legal pre-existing non-conforming use is terminated after it ceases to operate for more than a year. So, and the body shop in the middle of a neighborhood commercial district up above. If the neighborhood is really changing and property values are high for other uses, and this is really bringing down the neighborhood, the governing board, the city council, town board, or village board of trustees can decide to pass what is generally unpopular political, generally politically unpopular. They can pass an amortization. They can amortize that use out. They can say the zoning changed 5 years ago, and this use continues to operate. There's no sign of its terminating. We would like to see it move in and recuperate its investment, the owner recuperate his investment in 10 or 12 years. And these laws are rare, but they do exist. And in one case I know of in a village near where I live, and you see these all over the place. The sign regulations changed, and the signs are now required to be a lot smaller than they used to be allowed, and they have to be lit from outside. They can't be backlit plastic signs. And there was a hardware store down the street from McDonald's that changed hands, and they used to have a big sign, and now they have this really small sign. And all of the other signs in the neighborhood are pretty big, but some of them have been changing as the businesses change hands. And as we've seen in a lot of places, the McDonald's restaurant was replaced. The building itself was replaced, but the sign was gigantic. The restaurant was demolished and rebuilt, and the sign was left in place because it was grandfathered. And this village passed an amortization law of 5 or 6 years, amortizing out those pre-existing non-conforming signs that were oversized. The law passed. A lot of those signs are still there because it's a difficult thing to enforce. Politically, it's difficult for the village to say, hey, you've got to take this sign down and replace it. Although it's a law that these are laws that have withstood challenges. Okay, spot zoning. Any questions at this point? Nobody yet. Okay, so the definition of spot zoning is to rezone one or a few parcels for the benefit of the owners and the detriment of those parcels around those rezoned parcels. So the example here is a used car lot in the middle of a village that looks fairly residential in character. Arguably, that used car lot is to the detriment of the surrounding properties and not to the benefit, as a corner market or a little grocery store or a bakery or a little restaurant might be. I think of the number of neighborhood commercial districts and urban neighborhoods that have a mix of uses. That's a trend now in zoning, to zone for a mix of uses. And a lot of the time, those uses that serve the neighborhood that are different from the uses around them are an asset to that neighborhood. Even something like a dry cleaner, which could potentially have some conflicts for noise and traffic and even environmental issues, a dry cleaner arguably serves the neighborhood around it. So think about that. That is an important distinction with spot zoning, or that distinguishes spot zoning from rezoning a parcel for a different use from those around it for the benefit of the neighborhood as a whole. And this line is from, I believe, the case that really defined spot zoning in the early 1950s in the Lower Hudson Valley. And it's from our publication, Zoning in the Comprehensive Plan. This is taken from Zoning in the Comprehensive Plan. And what the court said was that it was really just what I described. It's not whether the area rezoned is different from those around it, but whether it was accomplished for the benefit of individual owners rather than pursuant to a comprehensive plan for the for the general welfare of the community. So if the zoning on that one or a few parcels changes and it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, then it isn't spot zoning. If it's for the general welfare of the community, it's not spot zoning. And this case involved a property owner who had a couple acres of land, and there had been a report done by the village a number of years before that identified the need for multifamily housing. And I think even suggested that parcels that were more than 3 or 4 acres in size should be considered for multifamily housing. So Rogers said, I'd like to, or no, maybe it wasn't Rogers. Rogers was the one who challenged it. one of the property owners said, I'd like to do that. Let's rezone my property from single or two-family to multifamily. And the village complied, the village agreed, the village board of trustees agreed. There was this report and this need for more multifamily housing. And the neighbor with not that much property said, hey, you're spot zoning. I live right next door to that property, and you're changing the zoning on her property and not mine. And that's spot zoning. And the court looked at it, and even the case that defined spot zoning said, no, this isn't spot zoning. This is in accordance with a plan that the village issued a number of years ago. And then we'll go into a few of the spot zoning cases that I researched from more recent years. The first one being not too far from here in the city of Oswego, in which the city rezoned a parcel for a downtown hotel, which I haven't seen. I haven't checked this out. It's been a few years since I've been in Oswego. We have a question. Yes?
You referred a few times here to this comprehensive plan.
Mm-hmm.
What if you feel that the comprehensive plan is in error? For example, that you might have like one area that's designated totally agriculture, nothing else, you know, in single family. And somebody wants to come in and, like you said, they want to put in like a little grocery store in this R1 area. And the people are in favor of it, but the plan says you can't do it. Is there any
recourse? Ideally, the comprehensive plan would be updated, and the local governing board, and it doesn't have to be a years-long process. The local governing board could say, hey, you know, you're right. The comprehensive plan doesn't say anything about the need for services in this area. Everybody has to drive 10 miles to get a quart of milk or whatever they need. And we should revisit this, and we should amend the comprehensive plan. That's one way to do it, and it's probably the best way. Another way is to just acknowledge in the purpose statement of their law, in the justification, that although the comprehensive plan does not recognize this, there's general agreement. The Zoning Board of Appeals couldn't grant a use variance because it didn't pass the 4-part test, but there's general agreement on the Zoning Board of Appeals, on the local governing board's planning committee, as was the case here, that the parcel should be rezoned in this way, and neighbors do not object. And we will update the comprehensive plan accordingly in a few years when we revisit it. I think that's something, and there are a few cases that do just that. One in particular. So that's an option. Thanks for your question. Anybody else? Okay. So in this case, the plan, if you go to the bottom, the rezoning for this hotel was consistent with the city's comprehensive plan. So that's an easy one. The plan said we need a mix of uses, and a hotel is one of them. I'm just guessing that it said that the court said this rezoning is consistent with the comprehensive plan. And but even so, and this goes to the question, the court said, and this is a line that's frequently cited. There's a strong presumption in the validity that exists in zoning amendments by a local governing board. These are people who were voted into office, and I always emphasize because I heard a mayor say this a few years ago, and it really struck me as being very true. And it's among the reasons I'm always happy when there are members of local governing boards in our audience, that one of the most important things you do as local governing board members is determine the use of land in your municipality. You budget and you run the municipality, and there are probably different departments that you oversee and how well they function. But among the most important jobs of an elected local official is determining the use of land. Members of the planning board have to carry out that law adhered to in their site plan review and subdivision, administration of subdivision regulations, and granting of special use permits it's often the planning board, but sometimes the zoning board of appeals. And then the zoning board of appeals is the court that is the check on that local regulation. So a strong presumption of validity, the court said, exists in zoning amendments by local governing boards. And such amendments won't be disturbed unless they're found to be in conflict with the comprehensive plan. So it was a really good question, but there are even ways of saying this really is something that our comprehensive plan doesn't say specifically, but it should, and we're going to amend it. It's the reason why it's best to amend the comprehensive plan so that it's consistent with that zoning change. But even if it isn't, there's a case a little later on that says there are ways to make that justification. So down on Long Island, in this case, and these went to the state Supreme Court as the lowest court in New York, it's the trial court, and then the appellate division, and then the Court of Appeals. So most of these cases went at least to the appellate division. There was a proposal to rezone a tract of land from 1 unit per acre to a retirement community. And it was, gosh, I forgot how many acres it was in total. I think it wasn't quite 60. I think it was something like 40 acres. And several of them, for the 66 unit proposal, they'd be retirement and several affordable. The master plan, as this town called its comprehensive plan, included goals of maintaining low density, but also said that the population was changing and there was a real need for a diversity of housing, including affordable and senior housing. So what this proposal did was it was in conflict with that one part of the comprehensive plan, the low density part, but it was consistent with the other three: diversity of housing, affordable, and senior housing. But because of the higher density of the proposal, the rest of the property was able to remain in open space. So they preserved the open space while providing for senior and affordable housing. So a neighbor did challenge this, and the court found that the rezoning was consistent with the overall priorities of the comprehensive plan and said it's not spot zoning. In this case, in the town of Guilderland, just west of Albany, there had been a rezoning of what was kind of a commercial district. There's a lot of commercial property in the town of Guilderland. It's where Crossgates Mall is and a lot of big box stores. And the town decided that it was time to create a diversity of housing and a mix of uses in some of its neighborhoods, and decided that there was a need for long-term care facilities and nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and changed the zoning in this area. And there were a number of developments that resulted, including an assisted living facility that when an adjacent owner said, we want to do something that's kind of like an assisted living facility, but not exactly, so we're asking the town board to broaden its definition of nursing facility, nursing home, so that we can do this. The town board considered it and went through. They agreed. This is a good thing for that neighborhood. The owner of the assisted living facility said, that's spot zoning. You're zoning for that person to the detriment of us. And the court said, you don't even have standing to the owner of the assisted living facility you don't even have standing to make this challenge because you're only challenging it because you're fearing that it's going to affect your business. It's not affecting the character of the neighborhood. But the court went ahead, in spite of saying that the challenger didn't have standing, the court went ahead to say, and said more precisely, zoning, the challenger did not have standing because zoning does not protect business interests. The court still went ahead and said it's not spot zoning because the original change to the zoning was to encourage a mixed-use neighborhood. And the change in this definition actually furthered the original purpose of the law. So the court said that this is anything but spot zoning. This is the case where there was no, where the comprehensive plan didn't mention the possibility for the new use for what was used by the military. It was owned by the military in the town of Rotterdam, a little west of Schenectady. It was zoned industrial, but because it was used by the United States government, it was immune from zoning. That's another conversation, government immunity from zoning. But when the U.S., I think it was the U.S. Army, sold the property, so it was, the U.S. Army used it for multifamily housing. And then, but it had been zoned industrial. So when the property was sold, the new owner said, yeah, this would really be good. It would really be good to keep this property for multifamily housing. And requested that the town update the comprehensive plan and rezone it for multifamily housing. Now maybe the town, I believe that the town rezoned it before it updated the comprehensive plan. But the owner went about it in the right way, I'm reminded here. And a neighbor operating an industrial park said, that's spot zoning. You can't change the use of that property. This is an industrial zone. The court considered the factors that would constitute spot zoning, including consistency, lack of consistency with the comprehensive plan, the compatibility with surrounding uses, and the likelihood of harm to surrounding property. Now, I guess it could be argued that encroaching residential development could threaten the viability of an industrial area. And industrial areas are important for creating jobs and tax revenue. But the court agreed with the town. The town said that the proposal would benefit the community. And I think this is one of those cases where the town, it's unlikely that a court is going to overturn. I'll quote again the court in the Oswego case. There's a strong presumption of validity that exists in zoning amendments by local governing boards. So the courts are generally inclined to agree with local governments when the elected local governing board decides what's best for the town. And unless there's an egregious conflict there, the courts often side with local governments. I had to look pretty hard for a real spot zoning case, and that last one was a little bit of a surprise. But I had to go all the way back to 2008, and I had to go to New Jersey. Now, in New Jersey, for whatever you think of New Jersey, the Supreme Court is the highest court. It's not the lowest court like it is in New York, so that makes a little more sense. But in this case, in the township of South Brunswick, the New Brunswick is where Rutgers is, so I guess a little south of there. The developer actually filed a site plan for professional office and retail buildings that met the requirements of the C1 zone. It should have been a site plan review where the planning board went over the design of the proposal and the site plan was maybe modified and then granted. This was an as-of-right use, an as-of-right that needed site plan review. It was not a zoning change that needed a variance or any kind of relief. This was an allowed use in the neighborhood. But all of a sudden residents said, gosh, we don't want more retail. That's going to result in traffic, noise, dust, and pollution. And so they asked the township, they asked the town board, they petitioned the town board to rezone that property. The council amended the zoning and said, well, it's inconsistent, although this is inconsistent with the master plan, rezoning this property to just office will prevent the intensification of traffic congestion that would have resulted from further commercial development. And this is where, like, I go back again to members of local governing boards and people who, and the importance of educating people about land use, because when there's a proposal for something that people don't like, they come out of the woodwork and they say, you can't do this. And a lot of time you can't say no. If the zoning is for the commercial office, the office and the retail, that's what was decided in the comprehensive plan. It's what the local governing board decided when it designated that zone. And this was like in the thick of the retail part of town. So think about, and a lot of the time in the comprehensive planning process, there's something called a build-out analysis, where a consultant will imagine for the community what it would look like if everything were developed according to the zoning. And a lot of the time that shocks people because they realize how much commercial zoning they have in their towns and elsewhere, and how there isn't possibly the population. We're kind of seeing it already with the changes in retail and increasing internet retailing. We have more commercial space than we know what to do with, and there are a lot of empty buildings around. Yes, Mike?
If the developer filed the site plan before the property was rezoned, did they have to go through the site plan review process because they filed it before the rezoning?
I think technically, I think it's possible if they filed it before the rezoning, then, and we'll depart from the story for a minute just to answer the question, to go through the hypothetical scenario. Even if they're granted permission even if they're given the green light for the site plan, and the local government says, oh my gosh, this isn't what we can't handle this in our community, and they pass a moratorium law. If there are no vested rights, then and vested rights mean if the developer hasn't stuck a shovel in the ground and invested money in building the structure, then the local government can, in many cases, legally change the zoning at that point. So it's not the determining factor in this sort of case is not whether the application was submitted, but if vested rights were accomplished. And we're teaching land use moratoria tomorrow evening, and our publication, Land Use Moratoria, cites a number of cases where the developer hurried to achieve vested rights, and the court still said, like, they built the building fairly flimsily, and the court said, no, you don't have vested rights. You tried to do this just to get vested rights, and the local governing board was going to change the law. But in this case, the local governing board did change the law. So the site plan was submitted. There were no vested rights, but the local governing board did change the law, listened to the neighbors, and the Supreme Court of New Jersey said that the action, the rezoning for the neighbors, for the benefit of the owners and for the benefit of the neighbors and the detriment of the owner of the property, was arbitrary and capricious, unreasonable, and impermissive spot zoning. And the court's test was, If the action was to further the comprehensive plan, it was planned zoning, and it's legitimate. But the intent and effect in this case was to benefit the neighbors by rezoning one parcel differently than those around it to the detriment of the owner. So this was something I'd never even heard of before. It was reverse spot zoning. And I searched a bunch of cases, and this was the only instance of spot zoning I could find. I would have loved to have had a pure spot zoning case, but in this one it was reverse spot zoning. So the court didn't say, the reason we're overturning this decision, the reason we're invalidating this decision is because of the timing. It's because of the rationale, or lack thereof. There was no study that said, the town didn't issue a study that said that the commercial development, and chances are, if they had done this, and I'm going out on a limb here, if the town had said, let's delay the approval here and do a study. Is this commercial neighborhood overdeveloped? If we add this number of square feet of commercial space, will it increase traffic to the extent that US 1, if it's US 1 that in fact passes through South Brunswick, I think it's a couple of US highways, and 202 is around there too, I think, that these roads will be a D level of operation. These roads will become impassable for most of the day if this commercial development is built. Then they would have had the study that said this justifies the amendment to the comprehensive plan and the rezoning. But what the town board did was they just said, yeah, we're going to listen to those neighbors. It's not consistent with the comprehensive plan. Yeah, we're rezoning. So back to the question, is it possible to change the zoning without support of the comprehensive plan? Yes, but it's best to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So that's why I said ideally you want to change the comprehensive plan first. And do those studies that prove what you're claiming, especially if you have somebody who's going to challenge the decision. Yes?
That word intent can cause confusion at times. If you read a zoning law and what's actually rated black and white, you have to go by what the law says. But yeah, you get people that will challenge it. And if you happen to talk to a planning board member from 20 years ago, they'll say, well, that wasn't really the intent of the law. How does intent come into play?
Well, we talk about intent a lot of the time when we discuss interpretations by the Zoning Board of Appeals. So if somebody disagrees, if there's a disagreement between the applicant and the enforcement official, then the result is that the next step is an interpretation by the Zoning Board of Appeals. And what does the Zoning Board of Appeals have to go on? First off, they're a group of people who put their heads together. And then what they do is they look at the law, they look at the comprehensive plan, and then they can look at the minutes of the meeting at which the comprehensive plan and the zoning were adopted to see if they can glean what the intent was. Lacking any hard evidence, they can make an interpretation. If the local governing board at the time says, oh my gosh, they're totally off, that Zoning Board of Appeals is crazy, we've got to clarify the intent of our law. That's why that would be maybe an ideal situation where the town board says, we have to clarify this, or the planning board says the intent is not clear, and there's conflict. This member of the board from 20 years ago doesn't agree with our interpretation of it, so we need some clarification here. And you, as a member of a planning board, for example, could say, I want to pass a resolution by the planning board that we clarify the intent of this law, and that it mean what you think it means. And then you pass it on to the local governing board to say, we would like this language added to the intent of the zoning regulations. regulations and the comprehensive plan. It's in your ability to do that. Before I switch to the next slide, this is related to Mike's question. And I'll try to do this as well as really case law update do. And I'll hope I can come close to measuring up. In the town of West Bloomfield in, I think it's in western New York. I know it's in western New York, maybe Erie County. The owner of a mine leased the land when mining was permitted. So mining was permitted in the zone, and the owner said that the owner of the property leased the land to a mining company. The town passed a moratorium on sand and gravel mining, and I'll go to this slide. The town passed a moratorium on sand and gravel mining before a special use permit was issued, and ultimately prohibited mining. So the town passed a moratorium and said no mining. The land was leased. I don't know if the permit was issued yet. But, oh no, it wasn't issued. Of course it wasn't issued. So the town passed a moratorium and said no mining for a while. And then the town changed the regulations before the special use permit could be issued, and said no more mining on the, we're making the moratorium permanent, no more mining in this district. The owner applied for a use variance. Now I would think that the owner put the application in before the zoning changed. The ZBA denied the use variance and said that the applicant failed to prove 3 of the 4 factors. So only proved 1 factor. So 3 down, only one yes. And I know why I kept this on the other slide, because I didn't even want you looking at the slide. What did the court do? The Zoning Board of Appeals, the zoning changed on the person put an application in for a mine. It was an allowed use. The town changed the zoning and said no more mining allowed here. What did the court? Appealed for a use variance. The Zoning Board of Appeals said no. What did the court say? Did the court say, give them the use variance? Nobody's, it's a trick question. It surprised me, and I didn't do a very good job at this slide because I bumbled through the details here. But a really good attorney would trick everybody. It was a surprise. It's a surprise question. It's a trick question. The court actually found that the Zoning Board of Appeals test was properly applied and upheld the denial of the use variance in this case. So there were not, and I think the key here was that there were not vested rights. The owner had, and I know there's a case near Albany. There's one town in Rensselaer County where there's constantly a court battle between the mine and the town, and I have to research that one because the town hasn't been as successful as it was in this case. In this case, the town said, change the zoning. There were not vested rights by the mining company or presumably the owner. And I think that's the key detail. And the moratorium was passed. There was a relatively swift changing of the zoning regulations and restriction of the use for mining, the restriction of mining in that district. And then the use variance. And that use variance test is very hard to prove. So the Zoning Board of Appeals said no. And I imagine they were probably in a position of saying, yeah, you've owned this land. The land was leased for mining. It's been zoned for mining for all these years, and then they changed it on you. But the Zoning Board of Appeals stood its ground, and the court agreed, said it was a properly applied test. Some of these other cases are a little easier. In the town of Bedford, a very wealthy town in northern Westchester County, there was a site plan proposal for a car wash with an express lube and detail. It was mostly in the roadside business zone, but a part of it was in a residential district. The zoning board of appeals granted both use and area variances that were requested. A neighbor, and the neighbor challenged the use variances, the use variance that was granted, and the state Supreme Court found that the use variance was not supported by a rational basis. In other words, the test had not been proven. The appellate court agreed, so it went to the Supreme Court, said the zoning board of appeals granted an illegal use variance. The appellate court agreed, yes, the hardship must be demonstrated by dollars and cents proof. This is a line taken from a number of cases. But the owners said, well, without the use variance, the property available for our business was reduced by 27%, the value, and for retail by 35%, and for office by 53%. The court said that oft-repeated line, from, I believe, Petrozzulli, the case that we talked about in the first factor, the reasonable return test. Developers and owners are entitled to a reasonable, not necessarily the most profitable return. In this case, in Delaware County, in the village of Hancock, there was a business that was non-conforming, it was industrial manufacturing, and it expanded illegally. So it was a pre-existing legal non-conforming use. If it hadn't expanded, it would have been fine, but it expanded, didn't appeal for a use variance. The court, neighbors learned about it, and a court issued an injunction for the expansion to cease, and for the use of the expansion for non-residential purposes to stop. The owners appealed for a use variance and were granted one. And imagine being the zoning board of appeals. In this case, it's an industrial site in your village. You don't want to lose it. You want to help them out. This would be a tough one for, I think, many members of zoning boards of appeals. So they granted the use variance. Neighbors challenged that use variance, saying that the owners hadn't proven that the property was incapable of making a reasonable return. In fact, the property was making a reasonable return as a pre-existing non-conforming use, but they wanted to expand the business. The owners said that it would cost so much to find another parcel in another place that they'd go out of business without that use variance. Again, this is a really tough one. As a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, having a business owner say, if you don't grant this use variance, we're going to go out of business in what's not a very prosperous part of the central part of the state. Hancock is a village with not a whole lot going on. So this Zoning Board of Appeals had a tough appeal on its hand. They granted it, but the court said no. This claim that you'll go out of business does not constitute dollars and cents proof that the property could not realize a reasonable return. And the court said, lacking that proof, the use variance should not have been granted, another illegal use variance, and invalidated it. And I was pretty interested in this one because I thought, did the business cease to operate? Did it go out of business? No, it's actually relocated to the village of Sydney, and it's operable. So they didn't go out of business after all, so it had kind of a happy ending, I hope. Yes?
When the ZBA grants a use variance, that doesn't dismiss the requirement to go back to the planning board and go through the rest of the process with a special use variance, does it?
It shouldn't. And that's a really good question that I think often gets overlooked. Use variances should be rare. And a lot of municipalities, I would say most municipalities, don't have a process for like a site plan review process for granting use variances. If the use variance is granted, there should be a process for going yes, back to the planning board for site plan review. And that use should, it's both the zoning board of appeals and the planning board should weigh in. The zoning board of appeals can attach conditions to the variance, including setbacks and scale and certain design criteria. And then the planning board would adapt or would apply the provisions of site plan review for that particular use. So in this case, industrial, in other cases, commercial or business, in neighborhoods where they aren't generally permitted for those types of uses. So yes, short answer to your question,
So
yes.
would it be, we had that in town, so a few years back, the ZBA granted the use variance for an individual to operate a garage in an area where that wasn't permitted.
Mhm.
The owner walked out with a use variance and started to operate it, but now parks cars everywhere.
With no
And
conditions.
so
Mhm.
the code officer
Mhm.
says, what am I supposed to do? He has a use variance.
Yeah.
But he's not obeying any of the other rules. So, you know, and
Mhm.
here we said, nobody seems to quite know what to do with it.
Yeah. Well, hold that thought. We'll get to a discussion on that in just a few minutes. A few more cases. The Village of Amityville on, that's Long Island. There was an application for a body shop, so similar to your scenario, in 2 zones. The special use permit was granted for an expansion. A use variance was granted for parking in a residential zone. So another one that straddled 2 zones. Neighbors appealed. They said this use variance is not justified. The appellate court upheld the special use permit, said the special use permit's fine. That's consistent with the zoning regulations. But it annulled the use variance, said the use variance in the residential zone shouldn't have been granted, and because the applicant failed to prove an inability to make a reasonable return on the property that was available, and on this sliver in the residential zone, which probably could have been sold or used for something else. In this case, it was an illegal use variance, but a legal special use permit, a legal special use permit that was granted, and the court made that distinction. In the city of Mount Vernon in Westchester County, the Zoning Board of Appeals granted use and area variances for a business of a type not permitted in one of the general business zones. And when challenged, the Zoning Board of Appeals was unable, the court found, to demonstrate that the owner was unable to make a reasonable return on any of the permitted uses in that zone. So once again, the Zoning Board of Appeals said, yeah, you can have the use variance, but didn't go through all of the permitted uses in the zone to say, well, can you make a reasonable return on the property if you did any of these number of things that are permitted? And this one surprised me in a way because it was, and I would have said if I don't think the case was specific about the particular business, or I would have said something about it here. But this is one where if everybody agreed, if the Zoning Board of Appeals said, boy, this business, if they're ready to go in, it won't change the character of the neighborhood, but they're unable to prove the 4 factors, 3 of the 4 factors. They can prove that it won't have a change to the character of the neighborhood, but they can't prove that the hardship wasn't self-created, that it's a unique circumstance, or that the property isn't able to make a reasonable return with any of the number of businesses that are allowed. So let's make the recommendation that this particular business be added to the list of allowed businesses in that zone. That's one that would probably have been pretty easy. But I think one of the reasons, well, what does everybody here think? One of the reasons use variances are granted instead of zoning amended, my guess is first, that people are afraid of spot zoning, and two, that the process of rezoning is feared to be too long involved, that it'll take 6 months to happen.
I think the process of rezoning also could be fiscally burdensome on a municipality with legal expenses.
I think that that's probably shared among a lot of local officials, and I think that it shouldn't necessarily be. And I think personally and professionally that it shouldn't be. And we as local officials should probably do what we can to avoid that, because you've probably all heard the term, and there's a slide to demonstrate this, but do you recognize, first off, well, I'll go through this one very quickly. Same thing happened in the city of New York. The Board of Appeals in residential real estate this was 10 years ago, but residential real estate in New York is out of control now, as is commercial prices, commercial real estate prices. In this case, the Board of Appeals granted a use variance for construction of a commercial building on a parcel zone residential. And the Court of Appeals reversed, actually, a decision of the appellate court, finding the uniqueness factor wasn't satisfied, even though there were other parcels that were zoned commercial. The court really said this should have been rezoned instead of granted a use variance. And it's because the use variance test is so difficult to prove that when courts look at the rules, when a decision is challenged and a court has to look at the 4 factors, those 4 factors are very strict, and the court can't say that the 4 factors were satisfied in this case. And it would have been if the city council had rezoned it, and this is New York City. It's a lot more difficult to get anything done in New York City than it is anywhere else in the state. Certainly rezoning, but that's what the court said. And the reason, so you notice a trend with, and I didn't just selectively pick these cases to make the point. I had a really hard time finding a case in which the court said, this is spot zoning. Most of them said, no, it's not spot zoning. And I had a really easy time finding cases in which the court invalidated use variances that were granted. And the reason it's so important, the reason we're doing this course, is because you've probably heard the term zoning runs with the land, not with the owner. So once you grant a use variance, if a zoning board of appeals grants a use variance, it's usually irreversible. Whereas zoning, we think of as being so hard to change, is not irreversible. And a case that kind of speaks to that is one that we talk about in the interpretation section of Zoning Board of Appeals overview, and it has to do with the Washington Avenue Armory in the city of Albany, at a really important intersection, commercial office neighborhood. And it's a huge building that was repurposed. It's what we call a white elephant that needed a new use. Everybody wanted to find a new use for the Washington Avenue Armory, and it started being used for conventions and sports and music concerts. And then there were a few incidents where there were rave music concerts where there were hundreds or even more, possibly more than 1,000 people in the audience, and they were like that. They were standing and they were wild, and they got out of the venue at 1 in the morning, and they were really loud, and there was an incident with police, and they made a lot of noise in the neighborhood, and the nearby residents decided with their in the form of or as a neighborhood association to appeal to the Board of Zoning Appeals, as it's called in Albany, to interpret the regulations. And the Board of Zoning Appeals said that, sorry about the text here, I didn't realize that it went under the photos. That concerts were a lot more like nightclubs than they were like auditoriums, and like fixed venue music events. So the auditoria were among the allowed uses, but there was no definition of auditorium or auditoria in the city zoning. So the city interpreted this use as, or this term, as allowing concerts or other performances with fixed seating, but that this use, these rave concerts, were more similar to the definition of nightclub. The state Supreme Court actually agreed with the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Board of Zoning Appeals and said, yeah, they should stop having these rave concerts. The Board of Zoning Appeals is correct. But the appellate division read on in the dictionary definitions and saw that auditorium could apply to both venues with fixed seating like we have here and those without fixed seating. So and ultimately the appellate division said this is arbitrary. This distinction is arbitrary. And invalidated it. So the Board of Zoning Appeals was kind of helpless in this case to stop the rave concerts. And I presented this slide near Albany a few years ago, and one of the members of the Board of Zoning Appeals said, yeah, the reason that normally, if the city had rezoned the property, we would have had much greater control over the hours of operation and the effect on the neighborhood. But because that property had been given use variance after use variance to allow it to function. So instead of saying we need to rezone this parcel in a way different from everything around it, because it really is unique, it has unique circumstances, we have to rezone it for that reason. It was given use variances instead. The city was stuck with a lot of those use variances that had been granted because they went through this four-step process, the four factors, and said, yeah, it's satisfied. So the zoning ran with the land, and the city didn't have available to itself all of the tools that it would have if it had rezoned it. If this property had been rezoned very specifically, very precisely to allow the use, or maybe not, but then the rave concerts had unintended consequences. The city could have revisited its zoning and amended its zoning and refined it and made it work. But when you grant a use variance, like the example to the auto parts or auto body or auto repair shop, without the conditions that control its use, then the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, or the cat's out of the bag. The cat's out of the bag. It's done, and it's very hard to reverse. And I had a question that was similar to that, and it had to do with a use variance that was granted on a property years before. It was I think it had been a restaurant, and somebody wanted to serve alcohol and they wanted it to be mostly a bar with some live music performance, whereas the definition of a restaurant is it's primarily food with a little bit of alcohol on the side. But they wanted to flip that, so they were granted a use variance. But it never opened. So the code official asked me, does the use variance go away? And she didn't like the answer. The answer was no, it doesn't go away. If that owner came back 15 years later and was knowledgeable enough to know that the use variance doesn't expire, it would go away if your local regulations say it does, and many do. I should say that right now. And that's the fourth bullet there. Only if a provision exists in the zoning that if a variance is not acted upon, then it would expire within, and it's usually about a year. So if I appeal for a use variance and I never open the business, then I think it's presumed that I didn't really need that use variance, that the property's making a reasonable return without it, so the use variance expires. It goes back to the idea of vested rights. If I open the business, then I've acted upon it, and I'm good. I'm good for generally forever. So I said, does your zoning have this provision? And she said, no. And I said, well, then that owner or somebody else could come back and open that tavern up. And she really didn't like that answer. And then I realized weeks later that we have the rehearing provision of zoning Board of Appeals statute. And when we talk about rehearing, when we teach zoning Board of Appeals overview, we're always kind of hustling to get to the end, and everybody's looking at their watches and they're thinking about lunch or whatever's afterward. But we talk about the rehearing section of statute. A board may have a rehearing. A zoning Board of Appeals may rehear an appeal that's never been reheard before. So they can rehear it once if all members of the zoning Board of Appeals agree unanimously. If all members present agree that they should rehear the appeal. And then they can reverse an earlier decision if all of those present at the rehearing agree to make that reversal. So that zoning Board of Appeals that denies that area variance, let's say, and then they say, let's rehear that. We should have granted it. We shouldn't have granted the full 15 feet of relief, but we should have granted 6 feet of relief. They can rehear it. Or they can rehear a variance that has been approved, has been granted. So they can say, well, we shouldn't have given that two-story relief in height, or we shouldn't have granted the use variance for the tavern. We should rehear it. So 15 years later, there's nothing in the statute that says there's any expiration. It just says it can be reheard once. So it's a very weird little section of statute that a lot of people don't know about, but it's in the Guide to Planning and Zoning Laws of New York State in that section toward the end of the zoning board procedure section. And it's in our publication, Zoning Board of Appeals, and we get calls about it occasionally. So this one probably could have been reheard, and yours might be able to be reheard, but there's a hitch. You can't reverse. If vested rights have been established, if somebody has acted in good faith upon the variance that was the use variance or area variance, as the case may be, that was granted, or the interpretation, if you change your mind and change the interpretation, but somebody has acted in good faith, you can't take it. I'm going to guess that, my educated guess in the case of the use variance that was granted in your town is that if you rehear it, you should be able to attach conditions to it. They have acted in good faith on the use variance that was granted, so you can't say, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have granted that use variance, because they're going with it. They've opened the business and they're active. But if there were no conditions attached to it, you can probably rehear it and attach the conditions that would make it more, reduce the number of conflicts between it and other neighboring properties in the neighborhood. So the rehearing statute or the rehearing section is a really important one, because zoning runs with the land. And this is why granting use variance is something that should be taken so seriously. So we're going to go through my informal survey here of all the cases that I looked at to come up with this, with these examples. And we'll start with area variances, which we haven't really talked about, but most members of zoning boards of appeals and others know that area variances are easier to get than use variances. So if Jean Waterbury asks for an area variance for her addition on her house of 10 feet to the closer to the rear property line, the stakes are probably not as high. It's not going to be as difficult to test to prove as that auto repair shop in a neighborhood, in an area where, in a zone in which it was not, that use was not permitted. So there were a number of cases in which the Zoning Board of Appeals said, no, Gene, you can't have the 10 feet of relief from your rear setback. And in some of those, in many of those cases, courts reversed the denial of area variances. So the applicant has a little more of a chance of getting the Zoning Board of Appeals denials overturned for area variances. But there were many cases also in which courts upheld denial of area variances. So the Zoning Board of Appeals said, Gene, you can't build that tower in your residential neighborhood. And she said, I'm going to challenge it, and the court said, no, the Zoning Board of Appeals was correct in denying that area variance. And then reversal of grant of area variances. There were a few instances where area variances were granted, challenged, and then the court reversed them, as we've discussed with use variances here. There were a few cases overall of the reversal of use variances. We went through a lot of them that I found. Most of the case law action for zoning boards of appeals is with area variances. There were lots of area variance cases. Not as many use variance cases, but the reversal of grant of use variances, which are the kind that we've gone through, there were a few. There were fewer instances in which courts upheld the granting of use variances. So it was rarer when the granting of a use variance was actually upheld. It was actually when the court said, yeah, that use variance should have been granted. There were a few. Instances of courts upholding the denial of use variances. Many. There were many cases in which the board said, no, you didn't meet the four-part test. And the court, it was challenged. The owner said, no, I want that use variance. I deserve it. I do meet the four-part test. And the court said, no, the Zoning Board of Appeals was correct. Many of those. I couldn't find one case, and that doesn't mean that they don't exist, but in my survey of, there were a couple hundred cases I think I scanned. I could not find a single one in which the court reversed the denial of a use variance. So that just goes to say that as a zoning board of appeals, if you have an intimidating applicant, an applicant who says, I deserve this use variance, I really want it, chances are, and I'm going to challenge you, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to take you to court if you deny me, chances are, even if that person does, that person isn't, that your board will prevail, that's a hollow threat. So that's it, and we've got some time for questions and discussion. And I should have stopped a little earlier to see if anybody else had any questions. Yes?
I have a situation kind of the opposite of a use variance never acted upon. We had a landowner and a realtor who got together and they subdivided the property into 22 lots before the town had a subdivision law.
Oh.
about 3 years ago. They did this. The town this summer just passed a subdivision law.
Oh,
How would these people, do they fall under the subdivision law now, or is there a time frame that they're granted to continue doing? I don't even know if the parcels that they subdivided into are meeting the requirements of the subdivision law.
well, the subdivision was granted, so it's.
Well, there was no subdivision law at all at the time.
There was no subdivision law, but the subdivision was granted prior to the passage of the law, and the deeds were, the plats were recorded with the county clerk's office. So I think that's a valid subdivision, for better or for worse. And, but the question is, will the parcels be purchased, and will anybody act? I'm assuming nothing was done with them. It's just lines on a piece of paper now.
They haven't done anything in about 2 years.
Yeah, and a county planner, a reputable county planner in this part of the world said to me a few years ago, we're seeing more abandonments of subdivisions than we are new subdivisions. So it might be that the owner is just holding those parcels and they might not sell. Now, if they are developed, if somebody wants to do anything with them, and you have subdivision regulations, do you have zoning? Yes.
Yeah.
So when those subdivided parcels are sold, if the individual who, let's say somebody wants to subdivide the lot further, then the subdivision law would come into effect, and the setback regulations, the zoning regulations, the setbacks, and other aspects of the zoning would come into play when somebody wants to act, when somebody wants to develop those parcels. So the subdivision is done, and there's the chance that somebody will want to re-subdivide it and combine lots again, in which case there's really not much to review because it's going the other way. But it's done because it was done before the law passed.
Someone other than the landowner, you're saying?
Yeah, well, whether it's the current owner of the property or somebody who subdivided the land and then sold all the lots to somebody else, it doesn't matter because zoning runs with the land, and so do these decisions.
If the map is filed.
If the map was filed, that's right. If it wasn't filed within, what is it? Is it 30 days? It's 60 days. It's 60 days for filing of the subdivision plat. If it's not filed within 60 days, then it isn't valid. Good point. Thank you for
But when they did go review, there was no place to start that 60-day timeline either. I mean, I had a survey done, he subdivided the lots, but that's all he did. They never filed the map. If they were offering lots for sale, there's
Right, so it had to be filed. So, right, that's a good point. So there was no clock, there was no start to that clock. But if it were approved, if it had been approved, if the subdivision regulations had been in place, he would have had 60 days to file the plat. But yeah, with lacking that, check to see if it's on file at the county clerk's office. Thank you for that, really, that good memory, good thought. Yep.
So a clarification, a subdivision runs with the land, just as a use variance does, if it's been recorded?
If it's been recorded, yes. A subdivision will remain, the lots will remain subdivided. And in fact, if the zoning changes and more property, usually, sometimes in some places, especially if there isn't zoning, the lots might be smaller. If the zoning changes, those are pre-existing non-conforming lots. And they still, in order to be developed, require area variances, but there's generally a little more, if they're already subdivided, the owner has the upper hand in getting approval for them because they're pre-existing, because they were already subdivided and sold. That's another one, that's another reason. I mean, why subdivision is really planted. When you're considering drawing those lines, think about it very carefully, because down the road, somebody who owns that parcel, it's very hard to say, no, you can't develop your parcel, because then that's a taking, right? So, anybody else? Mike, do you have any thoughts? Do you want to
No?
keep the conversation going, or should we,
Well, unless people have questions.
Nobody else is approved by the ZBA, person walks out the door with a use variance. That doesn't go back to the planning board for application of the area variance or area override.
Yeah. site plan?
Can they operate with just that use variance?
If your zoning regulations don't say anything, don't have a procedure for what happens after a use variance is granted, and I think few do, few zoning regulations, and check your zoning regulations next time you open them up.
I know that's not in
Having
there.
spoken of this.
So it should,
Very
so it'd be a good
few
idea.
say after a use variance, the applicant must go to the planning board for site plan review. There are very few out there that say that. So in most cases, yes, you're correct. Use
So-
variance in hand, the
So-
next step is the building department.
So the
for a
solution
permit.
is to put it into your zoning regulation.
It should be put into the zoning regulations, what happens after the use variance. But
Because that same kind of problem, didn't that apply to your armory example where, you know, they walked away with the use variance, but there was no application of hours of operation or any of those other things were not addressed.
well, the worst thing about the armory was the multiple use variances that were granted. It wasn't necessarily the procedure, and the planning board didn't get to look at it, because the planning board might not have realized that the concert venue would have this unintended consequence, this effect that nobody envisioned, of lots of people coming out really late, and there was just, it was done, and they couldn't reverse it, whereas if they had done it legislatively
Right. No, I
and
get that.
rezoned it, it would have been easier.
Right, I get
I
that, but
think
they
going
put
to the
chance-
planning board would not have, the planning board might not have had to do site plan review on it at all,
Right.
because there was no change to the structure.
Right.
So-
But things like hours of operation might have been addressed, and perhaps that would have mitigated some of the problems.
Yeah, it's something the zoning board of appeals probably should have addressed in its conditions, but there's a lot to consider. And as I said at the outset, your zoning is kind of a living document, and that's why you have to adjust it here and there to be to address new challenges that weren't envisioned when the zoning was passed. And that goes back to the comment earlier of the intent of the zoning law. Somebody on the planning board 20 years ago thought the intent was different from what the current board members think. So yeah, what you suggest is correct, that there should be a process where the use variances go back to the planning board for site plan review. But in the case of the armory, I don't know if it would have changed things, because site plan review for that armory, it was nothing on the physical exterior changed. So they might not have had to do site plan review, period. Anybody else?
Just continuing on that same thought, so an individual goes to the zoning officer and says, I need a permit for this, and it's not allowed for me to use variance.
Right.
Once the use variance is granted, should that not automatically go to the site plan review like any other use would?
Yes, and that's what we've been saying. Yes, it should.
I mean, but you're saying it doesn't.
What I'm saying is that process would not have necessarily
Wouldn't have
fixed
affected that
the
whole-
problem
no.
in the case of the armory, but absolutely,
But you're also saying we should put it in the law.
yes.
Okay, clear this up a little bit, like, I'm a municipal planner here, and our zoning ordinance is written that, in order for site plan review to be triggered, the square footage has to be 2,500 square foot or greater. And anything under that, there's no site plan review triggered, so the planning board has no jurisdiction. So that's, I think, kind of what their question is ultimately getting at.
Yeah, so, does your zoning regulation address when a use variance is granted, it would automatically have to go for site plan review if it's over 2,500 square feet?
No, there's nothing whatsoever in the zoning regulations about that process. So that's why we're in this trap, because somebody walked away with
Ours is 2,500 square feet irrespective of
Oh,
the
okay.
variance that's involved
Yeah.
or not.
Okay, so, and that makes sense.
Now, as part of the ZBA's approval of a use variance, do they condition it on that having to go through either site plan review or special use permit?
And that's a really good idea too, even if it's not in the law. So short of changing the law, you could put the, remember, zoning board of appeals members to condition the use variance, the approval of the use variance, the granting of the use variance on having to go through site plan review. Even if it's less than 25, even if it doesn't meet the trigger in most cases. You want to be extra careful. But the zoning board of appeals also has the ability to place those conditions. It's just, and I go back to the armory example, no one knew that all of these things were going to happen and that they were going to have these challenges, just like your gas station example. They didn't think to put the conditions in, and the planning board might not have thought of that either. They probably would have, but if it's done legislatively, you can always go back. If it's a use variance, you might be able to use the rehearing strategy. There was another question in the back.
Okay, we had a guy buy a parcel of land over the village project. Well, he had to get a variance, it's gonna cost a 10-year living room man.
Uh-huh.
He's not gonna do it. Well, he had to go and get a new variance.
Well, yeah, that's one way of doing it. What do you think he wants to do with it?
He's just leaving it, it's been that way empty for the last couple of years.
So he got a variance to put senior
Yeah.
residences on it,
Yeah,
and he never did that.
right.
So, do you know what he wants to do, or does he want to do anything with it?
As far as I know, he doesn't want to do anything with it now.
Well, senior housing is not a very controversial use for
Right.
most places, so it's unlikely it'll be challenged, but, so somebody else could come along and put senior housing on the parcel. But if he wants to do something else with it, he could appeal for a use variance for that, but the better way to do it would be to change the zoning on the parcel for the use that he wants, to do it legislatively, for the town board to change the zoning.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
This doesn't have to do with spot zoning, but I'm curious if you've heard anything about this. The gentleman was telling me, it was apparently someplace in New York State, that someone had built a nice home, and I think they had, let's say, a couple of acres or something like that. The municipality decided that they wanted to run water and sewer lines in that area, get some additional housing in there. So they changed the zoning so that they only had to have so much frontage to have a water line in there, or to put a house in there. Then what happened is that, I think it was like, I'm gonna say 7,500 feet, I'm not sure what the frontage was. But people went in there and they were putting in single family houses, and then they were coming back, all of these people, like a year later, and wanting to get an area variance so that they could put a garage, add on to their garage or something. So it basically was, house 2 feet, house 2 feet, type of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So the gentleman who had the nice house with the 2 acres of land, and all these area variances were granted, has sued the town for allowing all of these variances because the market value of his house has dropped so dramatically. And I didn't know if you'd ever heard anything about this.
No, I haven't heard a story quite like that, but generally when infrastructure is extended, growth will follow. And I know of one place in Schoharie County where a sewer line was extended for the user at the end, and it was a long-established business. And I was kind of surprised that there was so much money spent on it, and there were all kinds of grants acquired for it. A sewer line, and the town has encouraged growth along that corridor because there's not enough users for the sewer line. There's not enough flow into the sewer line. But it's expensive to tap in, and there just isn't the growth. So that's the other side of it. A lot of the time when you expand your sewer and water lines, you're going to get growth because that's water is life, and you can and there's a public investment there. So my guess is that the owner of that big house, although he might be correct, the value of it isn't as great because he doesn't have, he should have bought all the land around it to protect himself. But the value might be a little lower because he's got neighbors closer together, but there's a public investment in that infrastructure, and chances are he wouldn't have much of a case, especially if the local government that funded the utilities said, we have utilities here now, so this is a growth corridor. But that's how it goes.
But apparently his argument is that all these variances were allowed. That's apparently what he's saying.
Oh, well, area variance, that's an interesting approach, but maybe the area variances probably weren't the best way to do it. When I was a municipal planner and people were asking for lots of area variances for fences and pools, it was like every month the zoning board of appeals had nothing on its agenda but fences, fence heights, and pool setbacks. And the local governing board, the city council, decided to amend the regulations to allow it because it was kind of hard to say no to all of those people with those minor area variances. They accumulate, the town probably didn't go about it in the best way. But if I had to bet on that, and I shouldn't do things like that, especially not on tape, I would guess that the owner of the big house, though it's a creative approach, probably didn't win. Anybody else? Okay, we're kind of close. Mike,
Yep. No, that's fine.
Thanks for
We are looking at another training session towards the end of October, last